Okay, so it's 10 o'clock, so let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us, and really excited to have such a famous person in the world of Japanese baseball, Robert Whiting, here to join us and to share with us a lot of rich culture and texture and history of Jingu Gaien that will help us understand the importance of the stadium there and its role in Japanese baseball history. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Robert. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thank you very much. So what are we looking at? What's on the screen now?
Okay, so right now we can see you and some pictures of your books too.
My younger brother. All right, let's start. Meiji Shrine is a Shinto shrine complex built in 1920 as a tribute to the Emperor Meiji, who reigned from 1867 to his death in 1912. He presided over the so-called Meiji era, which ushered in a series of really dramatic changes that transformed Japan from an isolationist feudal state that had been closed to the world for 250 years and turned it into industrialized world power with the emperor as a figurehead. The Emperor Meiji assumed the throne at age 15 and oversaw a social, political, and economic modernization effort to catch up with the more industrial advanced West, importing many facets of Western civilization and inviting professors, engineers, and government experts to come to Japan and share their knowledge. The transformation into a modern state was really remarkable. When the shogun relinquished power, he was clad in formal samurai robes and the traditional top-knot hairstyle. A few short years later, the emperor was holding court in Western garb. By 1905, after emerging victorious in the Russia-Japan War, Japan had one of the world's most powerful navies. The Meiji Shrine Complex is the site of several Shinto festivals throughout the year. Around the main shrine outside is a forest 170 acres in size with 120,000 trees, consisting of 365 species from all over Japan. You'll see a map of this complex later. Excuse me, getting ahead of myself. The complex also contains a Meiji Memorial Picture Gallery with oil paintings showing the gradual westernization of court life. Court figures made the transformation from wearing kimono and hakama to Western-style three-piece suits. Meiji Jingu opened in 1926, and from the beginning it was the site of baseball competition involving Tokyo's elite Big Six University League baseball teams. By this time, by 1926, baseball was already the national sport of Japan, and it was a version of the game that had become distinctly Japanese. Baseball had originally been introduced to Japan in 1872 by an American professor, Horace Wilson, who had been invited to Tokyo to teach English at Kaisei Gakko, the precursor to Tokyo University. At the time, the concept of sport was alien to Japan. There were martial arts, which were designed for purposes of military training, and sumo, which was originally a religious ritual. The first higher school of Tokyo, seen playing here, was a prep school for Imperial University. It created a baseball team and grafted the philosophy of the martial arts onto it with a focus on endless training year-round, self-sacrifice, teamwork, and development of spirit. A majority of the students on this team came from samurai families, and the samurai ethic was paramount on the team. For example, there's the first pitch is being thrown out for a tournament here. The guy with the top hat looks like Odd Job in the Goldfinger movie. But for example, it was forbidden to use the word ouch during practice. So if a player got hit by a fastball in the nose and his nose started bleeding, that would really hurt. And he was allowed to use the word kaiui, which means it itches, because that was a sign of courage, not to say ouch. Players took 1,000 swings a night. Ichiko, as the first higher school of Tokyo was known, defeated a team of Americans from the Yokohama Country and Athletic Club in the first formal game between the United States and Japanese teams in 1896. The Japanese team surprisingly won, much better trained, but they won by a score of 29-4. This became headline news, and it was a symbol of what Japanese could do. The thinking at the time was, if we can beat Americans at their own game, then surely we can catch them in other areas as well. So in this way, baseball became the national sport. It was their first group game. Ichiko had an ace pitcher named Kotaro Moriyama, who became the first sports national hero in Japan. He inspired a saying, to be hit by Moriyama's fastball is an honor exceeded only by being crushed under the wheels of the imperial carriage. Here is, excuse me, the Ichiko team practicing baseball after school. The Ichiko way became the, what am I doing? Okay. The Ichiko way became the way of most other Japanese prep schools and college baseball teams as well. The Big Six University League began in 1925 and started playing at Meiji Jingu. It was hallowed ground for student sports in much the same way that Koshien was for high school players. Amateur baseball philosophy was epitomized by this man. His name was Suishu Tobita, and he was the manager of the Waseda University baseball team from 1912, I think, to 1926. And the Waseda team dominated college baseball in Japan and even defeated visiting American teams. Tobita was inspired by the Ichiko philosophy, and he compared baseball to Bushido, the samurai ethic in which only morally correct athletes could excel. He saw Zen ramifications in the sport. He once wrote the following: the purpose of training is not health, but the forging of the soul, and a strong soul is only born from strong practice. To hit like a shooting star, to catch a ball beyond one's capabilities, such beautiful plays are not the result of technique, but the result of good deeds, for all these are made possible by a strong spiritual power. Student baseball must be the baseball of self-discipline, or trying to attain the truth, just as in Zen Buddhism. It must be a baseball of pain and a baseball of savage treatment, for only with the constant cultivation of tears, sweat, and bleeding can a player secure his position as such. Tobita likened practice to the baseball practice to the religious penance found in Buddhism, a kind of asceticism, and he worked his players even harder than the players on Ichiko team had been worked. He would make his players feel ground balls until they were, quote, half dead, motionless, and froth was coming out of their mouths. This system came to be known as Shino Renshu, or death practice. He wrote, a manager has to love his players, but on the practice field, he must treat them as cruelly as possible, even though he may be crying about it inside. That is the key to winning baseball. If the players do not try so hard as to vomit blood in practice, then they cannot hope to win games. One must suffer to be good. So this formed the basis for college baseball that was played at Meiji Jingu Stadium. And the concepts discussed here, the concepts of total dedication, self-sacrifice, teamwork, development of spirit, are seen in other areas of Japanese life, even today. You can see them in the school system where, this constant study. And there are no janitors in Japanese school system because the students are expected to keep the school clean themselves as part of their education. You can see it in the corporations with the enormous amount of overtime workers have to do, spend their weekends doing corporate events. In the entertainment industry, where the entertainers are subject to indentured servitude, and also in the sumo world. Meiji Jingu Kyujo began construction in 1925. There's a photo of the construction crew. Rochelle dug up these photos, which I think are really cool. They don't look like they've been working very hard. Here are the original plans. You can see the park in the lower left-hand part of the map, and in relation to the rest of the complex, the distinctive architecture. You can see here the original plan at the bottom, I think that says 8,700 seats, which was greatly expanded since then. The many trees surrounding the stadium are a key part of the distinctive atmosphere. Here's the opening ceremony. Meiji Jingu was the heart and soul of university baseball in Japan. The biggest rivalry was the Keio Waseda rivalry. They played a couple of 3-game series every year, and their games drew huge crowds. It was like Michigan, Ohio State, if you're familiar with Big Ten football in the United States. Up to 60,000 people came to watch these games. There was a grassy slope in the outfield. You can't see it in this, you'll see it later, where you could sit down or lie down and watch the game. The ground was, excuse me, to give you an indication, the Keio Waseda games actually began at the turn of the century, but they were suspended in 1905 because the cheering groups would get into these really vicious, bloody brawls after the games. So the school authorities suspended the series until Meiji Jingu was built. Then they started them again. The ground was believed to be sacred.
Kind of like a sumo, the sumo, I forgot the word for it, but the place where they play sumo, because that's considered sacred. It was similar to that.
Something like that, or in the way that a martial arts dojo is considered sacred, you have to treat it with respect. When you walk in, you have to bow. To show you respect, there's usually a photo of the sensei, founding sensei on the wall. You see it in baseball stadiums. You'll see Japanese players in stadiums, even the pros, when they enter the stadium, they'll face the scoreboard and bow as a sign of respect. I've seen Japanese players even do that in America, in Yankee Stadium, which is kind of neat, I guess. But it's just a repository of purity and spirit, and it's a way of showing your respect for it. And Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Major League All-Stars came in and played at Jingu Stadium in 1934. Ruth hit 14 home runs. 65,000 people came to watch this particular game. He was extremely popular. 1 million people lined the streets of the Ginza to greet Ruth's parade and that of the other players on the team. And the Ruth tour was so successful, it actually inspired the creation of a professional league in Japan. People originally didn't think it would succeed because playing for money was somehow considered impure. But Ruth was so popular that the Yomiuri Giants were founded, and then the next year, 1936, the first Japan League started. But at that time, this is Matsutaro Shoriki, the founder of the Yomiuri Shimbun, and the guy who sponsored the Babe Ruth tour, whose newspaper sponsored the tour. And he was attacked by this angry rightist who buried a sword in his head. He survived, but this rightist had charged that the Americans had defiled the sacred area. Americans, being foreigners for one thing, and they shouldn't be in a place like, you know, the Meiji Jingu Shrine Complex. And the fact that they played for money. And, you know, Ruth was known for smoking cigars and drinking whiskey all the time. So he just thought it was really unseemly. So he attacked Shoriki and put him in the hospital. So it was, you know, it wasn't more complicated than that. It was something to do with newspaper. The guy had been hired by a rival newspaper, but the judge accepted his argument that his attack on Shoriki had been conducted out of patriotism, respect for the emperor. So the judge only sentenced him to 3 years, and he got out early.
Wow.
So Meiji Jingu was, baseball was suspended during World War II. And for a time it was used for military exercises. You know, the ball players were drafted by the military, and they would come back to the stadium and they would have grenade throwing contests. It was damaged by bombing, but then it was requisitioned by the Americans after the war and renamed Stateside Park. Allied forces restored it. They installed lighting inside. And a new natural grass field that it was used by American GI teams and Japanese amateurs and pros alike. The GHQ didn't really grasp the concept of the sacrosanct aspect of the field. So they said if professionals wanted to play there, they could. Where are we? Okay. So at the end of the occupation, the Allies returned the field to the Japanese, and it was renovated in 1954. Japanese professional baseball was played at Korakuen Stadium, which had been built in the 1930s. That was the home of the Tokyo Yomiuri Giants and a couple of other teams. But amateur baseball, Big Six college baseball, was played exclusively at Meiji Jingu. The sacrosanct status had been restored by the Japanese after the Americans had gone home. This is Shigeo Nagashima, baseball's golden boy, who played for Rikyo University, one of the teams in the Big Six University League. He later became famous as the captain of the V9 Giants. This person here is probably the most famous athlete in the history of all Japan sports, the most beloved. He's the only guy, he hit a home run, a sayonara home run in the only game professional game the emperor ever attended. Scoreboard was added in 1958. Stands were rebuilt in 1962. Expanded the grandstand, and there's a special box for the emperor put in the middle of this area in the upper deck. So it wasn't until 1962 that professional baseball was allowed to be played in Meiji Jingu Stadium on a regular basis. The Toei Flyers of the Pacific League moved in and called it home. And the first night game was played that year. It's when I first started going there. I just arrived in the military, and went down, saw my first baseball game at Meiji Jingu. And as you can see, there were those seats in the outfield. You just a grassy slope where you could spread out a blanket and drink. You know, the people would come around and sell beer and other things, and you could, you know, lie down and look at the sky between innings. It was quite nice, actually. This was my favorite player at the time, Hisao Arimoto. He's a Korean, a big star of the Toei Flyers. He's the only Japanese professional baseball player to get 3,000 hits in Japan. He was also a proud Korean who, unlike many other zainichi in Japan, did not try to hide his Korean heritage. In 1962, the Kokutetsu Swallows moved into Jingu, 1964, excuse me. And there they featured the legendary pitcher Masaichi Kaneda, who won 400 games over his career, more than any other player in history. His nickname was the Emperor because he had a really arrogant attitude, and he was the league's most dominant pitcher. Despite pitching for the Kokutetsu Swallows, who usually occupied last place in the Central League, he went 14 straight seasons with at least 20 wins. He led the league in strikeouts 10 times, won the Best Pitcher Award 3 times. He pitched for the Swallows from 1950 to 1964. Then he moved to the Giants in 1965. Unlike Harimoto, he hid his Korean ancestry. 1964, there were demonstration games played for the 1964 Olympics. The baseball was not played in the Olympics at that time, so this was just an exhibition for show. It's a goodwill game played with American ball players. In 1965, the Swallows were bought by the Sankei Shimbun, the major newspapers in Japan, and Sankei changed the name to the Atoms. The Sankei Shimbun was one of the leading advocates of nuclear energy at the time. They had no ties to the name Swallows. Shortly after that, the Sankei, the team was so bad that Sankei was embarrassed to own it. And they sold it to the Yakult Health Drink Company, and they became the Yakult Atoms, who continued to be, you know, maintain the tradition of finishing in last place every year. And here they lost 13 games in a row, and they were ordered by the owner to apologize to the fans for their poor play. So here, this is what they're doing, lining up in front of the first base side.
Sounds a bit like the Chicago Cubs.
Yes, it's just like the Cubs, yes. Outfield stands were put in 1967, so there were no more grassy slopes. Team was renamed the Yakult Swallows. In 1978, they won their first pennant ever and won the Japan Championship, won the Japan Series. The Swallows were known for their eccentric owner, the owner of the Yakult Health Drink Company. His name was Matsuzono. And his team had defeated the highly popular Yomiuri Giants, who usually won every year, most of the time. And he was embarrassed that his team had won the Japan Championship because the sales of the Yakult Health Drink had fell dramatically after they won the championship, because the Tokyo fans were angry that Yakult had beaten their favorite team. So Matsuzono assembled his players at the start of the next season, and he ordered them not to win the pennant, ordered them to finish in second place. They had a manager, Tatsuro Hiroko, who was a famous disciplinarian. He banned smoking, drinking, gambling, long hair, beards, and mustaches, Players living in the team dormitory were not allowed to hang laundry outside the windows because it was bad for the team image. The team became famous for its right field cheering section, Owendon, which issued transparent pastel-colored umbrellas to every member, which is, quite an enjoyable thing to be part of, and just to go to the stadium and watch. Just constant chanting. You had to take a screening test to join this cheering group. And they would, gauge how good your voice is, and they would tell you where to sit. They would issue a membership card, an Owendon card, and you had to sit in the same seat every time. The cheerleaders passed out an assortment of colorfully painted frying pans, drumsticks, and other noisemakers to fans. He assembled a small band too. This is one of the things that distinguishes Japanese baseball from the major leagues. You have this in all of the parks, the Owendon. The idea is that, in America, everybody does their own thing. You stand up in the infield seats and, scream at the umpire, blah, blah, blah. But everybody has his own shtick. But in Japan, that's considered bad manners. It's considered an imposition on the people around you. It just destroys the harmony. So if you want to scream and yell, you go out to the outfield and you sit in the cheering section, and then you can go crazy. But it's one of the nicer features about baseball in Japan. The Swallows were the first team to have a really live, active baseball star, Major League Baseball star in his prime, in the form of Bob Horner, who came here in 1987. Huge crowds came to see him, and he, hit a lot of home runs, but he really didn't like Japan. He didn't like the constant regimentation and practices, and he thought the umpires were unfair to him. So he turned down a multi-million-dollar offer to return, and he went back to the States. From 1992 to 2001, the team won 5 Central League championships. Famous catching star Katsuya Nomura was their manager for 3 of those championships. This player here is named Rex Hudler. He played in the major leagues and then came and played for the Swallows. I put his picture in because he became famous in Japan for eating a worm on the field during pregame practice. He did this to win a bet. I think he's the only person in the history of Japanese baseball to eat a worm before the game. I saw Vladimir Ballantyne break Hara single season home run record at 55 at Jingu Stadium. In 2013, he finished up with 60. He had the help of a juiced up ball, some people would argue. And here's the brand new star that everybody is talking about now. When they talk about Akami, he has 55 home runs now, and it looks like he will break Ballantyne's record. He'll probably wind up playing in the major leagues in a few years. He's only 22 or 23 years old.
Yeah, he looks really young, yeah.
Yeah, he does. Baby-faced guy.
Yeah.
He's really something. So I really like this Meiji area. I like the shrines, the trees, the evergreen forest, the ginkgo tree-lined avenue. This is beautiful oasis in the middle of a noisy, crowded city. Except on New Year's Eve, if you've ever been there at the shrine, it's just horrible. You're taking your life in your hands. It's so crowded. But the Meiji Memorial Picture Gallery is a national treasure. I don't know if you've ever been there, but you can see this series of oil paintings, which shows the transformation from the early days of the court when everybody was wearing kimono and samurai robes, and to three-piece suits, top hats and tuxedos and holding canes. It was quite something. So some people say that the 2020 Olympics were an excuse to redevelop Jingu Guyane because the building height restrictions were moved. Jingu Stadium is one of 4 stadiums existing in the world now where Babe Ruth played. One is Fenway Park in Boston, the other is Wrigley Field in Chicago, Scotiabank Stadium on the right. Now it's all at risk. In 2019, Jingu Stadium ownership with Japan Sports Council, Mitsui Fudosan and Itochu jointly finalized a plan to redevelop both Jingu Kyujo and nearby Chichibu-nomiya Rugby Stadium. Under this plan, Meiji Jingu will be demolished and rebuilt on the side of the rugby ground. The stadium, that is, well, the new rugby stadium will be built on the site of present Jingu Stadium. 2 high-rise buildings will also be erected in conjunction with yet another shopping mall, with the project scheduled to be completed in 2036. Also, the initial plan was that 971 trees, 70% of the greenery in the area, were scheduled to be felled, supposedly transported for replanting elsewhere, but it's not clear whether that's actually going to happen or if it's even feasible. If it goes forward, it's a tragedy, in my opinion. Jingu Stadium is architecturally well preserved. And, I agree with Rochelle that it should be maintained as a landmark rather than torn down and rebuilt. I wrote an article about this for the Yukon Fuji Evening Daily, and there's an English version online on my Substack site. But I'll just go briefly over the contents. Most of it was relating Rochelle's argument about why the plan should be scrapped. This Tokyo Metropolitan Government City Planning Council and Tokyo Governor Yuri Koike approved the planning area and framework of Meiji Jingu Development Project, with the specifics of the project and construction to be decided in the future. 2036 was the completion date. However, this plan does not seem to have been thoroughly vetted. The government released the details of the plan in December at the end of last year with a comment period of only 2 weeks. So discussion with the public was minimal. The Japanese National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, an advisory body to UNESCO, formally called for an urgent overhaul of the project to protect the urban heritage of the area. Rochelle's been leading an effort to stop this project, starting with a petition signed by 50,000 and sent to Koike's office, which the governor ignored. Rochelle cited a number of problems with this plan, which would change the iconic look of the area. They are as follows. All of the sports facilities in the park that can be used by the general public, such as the softball field, the golf driving range, the futsal courts, and the batting center, are to be eliminated. The only sports facility to remain is an expensive membership-only tennis club. The planners haven't explained why this project is in the public interest, why it is necessary and economically viable, and how it is economically viable for the citizens of Tokyo. The Tokyo government has apparently decided that the current baseball and rugby stadiums are outdated, but is this really the case? What's the point? She asks, of switching the locations of the baseball and rugby stadiums. It is not renovation alone sufficient. Do we really need another large facility when the newly built huge national stadium is right next door? Are the opinions of baseball and rugby fans being reflected? There are many fans who feel attached to the current ballpark and stadium, like me. Governor Koike has emphasized that the iconic 4 rows of ginkgo trees will be preserved, but the huge baseball stadium to be built will come very close to them, and it's feared that the roots will be damaged. Also, the exterior wall of the stadium will be right next to the ginkgo trees, which will drastically change the appearance of the area. Governor Koike's claim that the amount of greenery will be increased is a complete deception, Rochelle says. In the plan, lawns and low plantings are considered equal to trees that have lived for 100 years. Although the simple square footage of greenery may be going up, the volume of greenery is going down. There's not enough concrete data or explanation of the projected environmental impact of this redevelopment. It's clear, however, that increasing the number of skyscrapers and huge buildings, and on top of that, reducing the number of trees will result in huge CO2 emissions. Summing up, Rochelle says, to say, quote, to say that this is a reckless plan riddled with problems is an understatement. It's incredible that such an outrageous plan has been approved, but there is still the possibility to get it changed if we as citizens speak up loudly enough. We need to raise our voice and not give up. So I tend to agree with Rochelle and the ICOMOS, and I don't understand how or why this plan was allowed to continue to this point without any real public involvement, but I'm glad to see that the public is getting more involved now. I especially don't understand the need to move Meiji Jingu from its present location and replace it. Chicago managed to renovate Wrigley Field, which opened in 1914, without moving it. Boston managed to redo ancient Fenway Park, opened in 1912, without moving it down the street. Koshien Stadium and Miyagi Stadium in Sendai were similarly rebuilt. So why can't Tokyo do the same with Meiji Jingu Kyujo? This seems to be just another money-making scheme. So let's stop it. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And we have some questions that have come in. And so if anyone wants to put additional questions, there's a Q&A option in your menu. And I'm just going to say for any Japanese participants, if you want to put the question in Japanese, I will translate it. 日本語で質疑応答の質問をしたいのであれば、私は英訳しますので、日本語でもどうぞ質問を寄せてください。So let's take a look. First question, what do you think of the Yakult Swallows cheering style of using umbrellas?
Oh, I think it's great. It's really original. It adds a really nice aspect to going to the game at Jingu. I mean, Jingu Stadium is, you're sitting out there, you're surrounded by trees. It's just a really pleasant atmosphere. And, you know, the Oendan just add this unique aspect. There's nothing else like it anywhere else in the world. So I think it's terrific.
I'm just curious, why umbrellas in particular and why pastel?
I don't know. There's a guy named Okada who started this whole thing, and he was this baseball nut. He did this unpaid. He just came to every game, organized, and he would go with this group of followers would follow the Swallows around Tokyo when they went on the road. And I don't know what happened to him. I think he might have passed on. But you know, that's that's true fandom.
Exactly, because that's a lot of work and dedication to just create this whole thing, right?
Yes.
Okay. Next, this question, it's more like a comment. Hona was nicknamed Red Devil.
Yeah. Well, they call him, the Japanese was Akaone. Randy Bass was called the Kinpatsu Oni, I think. And then Charlie, anyway, and Warren Cromartie was the Black Oni, the Kuroi Oni. But Horner was they all played around the same time. And Horner was the Aka Oni. I don't know why they called him the Aka Oni, because his hair was blonde. But his face was red. It was always, flushed. He liked his beer.
Ah, okay.
But I think that's why they called him. But it was a kind of, it was a comic because he was such a dangerous hitter, right? And so it was a nickname to show that he, how scary he was. He was Osoroshi to the opposition. Now for fans, of course, it was great. That was a name that the Japan sports papers thought of.
Ah, okay.
Very inventive, the front page.
Great. So the next question here. Thank you very much for your lecture on the history of the baseball and the Meiji Jingu Stadium. Please let us know more about the value of the stadium as a historical architecture.
Well, I don't know if you can put a numerical value on it, but history is it's important to to remember history and to keep a sense of tradition through the years. There were plans to tear down Wrigley Field. I remember that was suggested, but fans are so irate that anybody could consider such a thing. It's like it reminds me of Tokyo Station. Back in the 1990s, as I recall, there was a movement to just tear down Tokyo Station and put up a new building. I think it seems to me that Japanese have less reverence for historical buildings than Americans do. It's a kind of Buddhist concept about the kind of things change, and so we just adopt with change. And the theme of Tokyo, as I outlined in my last book, Tokyo Junkie, has been one of constant change. There's this relentless assault on old buildings. In fact, I remember an architect told me, a Japanese architect told me that there are twice as many architects in Tokyo as there are in New York City. And the average wooden building is designed to last 17 years. The average concrete building was something like 35, and then glass and steel was a little over 40. But these buildings are designed to eventually come down. And the reason for that is to keep the economy moving, to keep, provide contracts and business for the construction companies, which are a huge part of the GDP. And, but, going back to Tokyo Station, so there was a citizen movement to stop that, and it was successful. And so they kept the structure as it is and redesigned it and renovated it. And now it's beautiful. I mean,
it really is.
Shining jewels of Tokyo. So, I think it's important we should value structures like Meiji Jingu Kyujo. And I'm also opposed to the idea of cutting down. There were like originally 2,000 trees. You're going to cut down half the trees in Meiji Jingu? Come on. There's no, there's very little park space in this city already. One of the great things about Meiji Jingu was just this wonderful oasis of peace and quiet and beauty. So yeah, I think the value is self-evident.
One thing I'll add too is you had mentioned the picture gallery that's in Jingu Gayan,
Right.
and Meiji Jingu was designed by the same architect.
Oh, really?
It was built at the approximately the same time, but it was the same architect.
Wow. What was his name?
I believe it was Hayashi, if I remember correctly. I just posted on the petition a guest post from Satoko Ohashi, who's a architect. And so she talks a little bit about him and the history, as well as the architectural argument for why it's possible to renovate it. It's not in such bad shape. The the developers are using the word decrepit. Oh, it's an old decrepit stadium. And she talks about why actually the concrete is actually in good shape, and it was seismically reinforced back in 2014. And so at that time, they would have checked all the concrete and would, it's has to have been fine at that point. So it's just a label that they're using as an excuse.
That's a good argument. That's good to know. That's another bullet in the chamber.
Exactly. Next question here. As a high school baseball fan, with the main games of the Tokyo High School tournament played at Jingu and Jingu Second Stadium, it would be sad to see it go.
Oh, yes, I agree with that. That's not a question, but I agree with that statement. Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
So let's stop it. Let's not let it happen.
Okay. I would like to see, excuse me. Sorry. I would like to see more pressure on operators, by which I think he means the developers of this, the people who are behind this development plan from abroad, please. So like wanting more international attention on this topic.
Okay.
Well, we'll do our best on that.
All right. I will.
Can you explain how come baseball was really popular compared with other sports in the beginning, compared with, soccer or rugby? Why did Japanese take to baseball in particular?
Well, it was their first group game. I mean, cricket was actually introduced before baseball, but cricket took too long. It took several days to play. And the students couldn't interrupt their study, to devote that much time to cricket. It was the first accessible group game. It was their first real sport because, as I said in the speech, there had been martial arts and there had been sumo, which was a kind of special thing that's religious and Shinto historical overtones. There was something called kemari, which the kind of kickball, which the imperial families played, but which is kind of an idiotic game because there's no scoring. So there were no real sports, and so when Meiji era opened up to all this outside influence, that's when these foreign sports like soccer and rugby came in. Baseball was popular because it had the group aspect, and Japanese really took to the hit and run, the sacrifice bunt, the teamwork aspect of it, which reflected the rice planting culture. And it had the one-on-one aspect, pitcher batter of sumo or kendo confrontation. It had no time limit, so there was plenty of time for discussion and little group gatherings during the game to assess strategy. And it was a game that really depended on statistics. I mean, a big part of baseball were the statistics that you looked at every day after the game in the paper. And also, I think that this game, the fact that the Japanese high school defeated the Americans in the first game, the Yokohama Country and Athletic Club had this baseball team. It was traders, diplomats, and some of the players were British and weren't even sure about the rules of baseball. But they played, and initially they turned down requests to play a game with this first higher school of Tokyo. It wasn't a high school, it was a prep school, and the average age of the students was 18 to 22, so it was college level. It was a prep school to prepare students to go to the Imperial University, which is where all the movers and shakers of Japan came from. And the Americans in Yokohama didn't want to play with the Japanese because they said our training will go bad because you guys aren't good enough. And they finally put pressure. They got the Gaime show to put pressure on Yokohama. So they played this game. And it was the first formal game, and the newspapers came down to Yokohama, and the players were allowed onto the ground of Yokohama Country and Athletic Club, which was unusual because Japanese are usually forbidden to enter. And so not only did they win, but they won by 29-4. And the Americans said, well, gee, we hadn't trained hard enough. So, you know, we want a rematch. And so the Japanese won the next one, 35-9. And then 26-18. The Americans didn't win until they pulled this professional player off a ship in Yokohama. So this was huge news. And as I said before, it was a symbolic message, you know, hey, listen, I mean, because Japan was really behind. They'd been this isolated country and they were trailing the world in industry and commerce. And, you know, they were forced to sign these unequal treaties. And so there was really a need they needed something to, you know, spark the national ego. And baseball was it. And the idea was if we can beat the Americans at their own game, then surely we can surpass them in other fields as well. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think if that pivotal game, that initial game, had been a rugby game, then maybe rugby would be the national sport of Japan. I mean, baseball was attractive for many reasons, but I think the big reason was because it showed they could defeat the Americans, and the Japanese have always set their sights on having a real World Series with the Americans over the years. That's always been their goal. And so, you know, it's just, maybe history would have turned out differently if it had been a rugby game or a soccer game or whatever, but it didn't, it wasn't. And so we have baseball as the national sport, and it's still the national, all the surveys, 2/3 of the people love baseball.
Okay, next question. You mentioned that there, I'm sorry?
I said I actually wrote a book about that.
Well, I know you wrote a couple books about that, so definitely people who want to know more about this should look at your books. You got to have WWII and Chrysanthemum and the Bat are two of my favorites. So, you mentioned that there was an attitude of sacredness towards Meiji Garden area historically. Does that attitude still exist, especially in the context of recent developments? If not, what caused this shift in attitude?
Well, I mean, the baseball stadium still has that, you know, professional. I think the reason that the pros were allowed to play in Meiji Jingu early 1960s was economics. You know, the Yakult Swallows were playing at Korakuen. They were sharing it with the Yomiuri Giants, and it just got too unwieldy. So economics, it was the Meiji Jingu Stadium is owned by the Meiji Religious Corporation, and you know it's a Shinto organization, but you know they like money just as much as anybody else. So it's a way to, you know, keep the whole complex going. And you know, amateur baseball is still in Japan has this aspect that the ground is sacred. It's like a karate or a judo dojo. You go in, you show respect. You know, you even see the pros do that. As I said before, they'll go in the stadium and they'll face the outfield scoreboard and bow as a sign of respect. So that side is sacred. I haven't been to Meiji Shrine in quite a while, but I assume people still go there and bow at the shrine.
One thing I'll mention too is that, you know, I've been monitoring very closely public reaction to this development plan, and there are a lot of voices who are upset that, you know, the trees in Jingu would be cut down because they were, you know, the whole garden was originally designed in, you know, sort of respect for the emperor. And at the time that they built Jingu people from all over the country sent money. They sent trees. So actually some of the trees in Jingu are kind of mismatched different types because, like, oh, someone sent this kind and someone sent this kind. There were a lot of donations of trees.
Right.
And also tens of thousands of people contributed manual labor to build Jingu. So it was, a huge project, and a lot of it was because of feeling that this was a sacred space. And in fact, I even saw one this morning. Frequently when I look at tweets in Japanese that are expressing unhappiness about this plan, I'll see people say that, well, if you cut down the trees in Jingu, you're going to be, cursed by the gods,
Yes.
kind of thing. So, the kami are going to come after you, and you probably don't want that to happen. I see that used frequently in the tweets. So I think there still is a sense that this is a sacred place and it shouldn't be converted into a money-making operation.
Right. The nice thing about Shinto is that you see everything has a spirit and a soul. Ichiro Suzuki used to take care of his polish his glove every day and before a game, and he had his bat and he kept it in a certain place on the bench. And when he was traveling on the road, he would put it in a humidor case and carry it with him. And his teammates couldn't understand that. I mean, they just came back and throw their gloves against the wall and drop their bat. He said, you got to show respect for it. And historians would say that that's he sees the Shinto aspect in his equipment, and you show respect for it, and it will, respect you back by providing you with a lot of hits and great catches in the outfield.
I feel like that respect for your tools is a big part of Japanese culture.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, next question here. Absolutely devastated to hear this plan. Has Koike publicized a timeline for the demolition and rebuilding?
Go ahead. That's your department.
Yes, and so my understanding is they're doing it in stages. That they're going to be, but they're going to be starting, sort of taking down Jingu Stadium and also the rugby stadium early next year. So that is the timeline. So that's why right now is our window of opportunity to try and get this plan reversed. So we're this fall, we're going to be very active in trying to make a lot of noise about this. And as I've talked with experts in government relations, et cetera, in Japan, basically everyone says, what you need to do is to make noise, because if there's a lot of outcry from the public, that's what politicians respond to. So we're doing our best with that. And so anything you can do to help spread the word and raise your voices will be helpful. I have a couple here in Japanese, and so I'm going to just translate them on the fly here. So Jingu Stadium is in the middle of the city, a green oasis, and it's it's got the greenery under a broad sky. It's just wonderful to be there in the stadium. And the idea that it could be lost by development is just difficult to believe, and it brings to mind the Japanese phrase mottainai, which means what a waste. And so I really want everyone to know that this is happening, and I really want them to preserve this stadium by renovating it instead of tearing it down.
Right. By the way, I understand that the two buildings, the shopping mall, is going to be modeled after Lalaport in Toyosu, and I live in Toyosu, 2 blocks. I'm looking out the window and I see all these high-rise buildings. I'm 3 blocks from the water and a really nice park, but I just can't imagine a shopping mall like Lalaport in the middle of Meiji Jingu. It's obscene.
It doesn't make any sense. And if you think about it just from a business point of view, there are plenty of places to shop in Omotesando and Shibuya and Shinjuku, which are nearby. Right. There's really not a need to have more in this area. Another one in Japanese, so give me a second, I will again translate on the fly here. Okay, so evidently the Yakult Oendan started to use the umbrellas in 1965 when the team changed from being the Kokutatsu Swallows to be the Sankei Swallows. And so okay, so what Mr. Okada, who started the Oendan, his idea was of using the umbrellas to make their small number of people in the Oendan look like it was more. And that was, it said that that's the reason why they did it. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that's true, because in the beginning, nobody went to see the Swallows games. There were very few people. They were so horrible.
Right. And if you got these umbrellas, you're going to look like more people. Yeah, that makes sense.
Good idea. I wondered about that.
Okay, so the thought here, the opinion here is that this stadium has value as a piece of architecture, and it also has value in terms of preserving and showing the history of the Jingu area and of baseball in Japan. For that reason, it really has high value and it really should be preserved.
Good, thank you.
Let's see. Thank you for a fun webinar. I also enjoyed the pre-event chats. I have been thinking that Mr. Okada introduced umbrella cheering. Oh, here. Yeah, this is probably the same comment as before, that he introduced the umbrella cheering in the 70s. But I found that when Kokutetsu, the Japan National Railway, bought the team and moved it to Jingu in 1963, it began to ask the fans to bring them. There were as few fans coming, so they wanted to make it look like there were more of them. So it sounds like it was the the National Railway put out a call for the umbrellas too.
Oh, I didn't know that. Interesting.
Okay. 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 So just saying hello here from Harashina Sensei. He's a famous expert on environmental assessment, and he's participating today. Let's see. One more. I'm just going to translate from Japanese here. 1 second. Okay, so even for more recent pieces of architecture, or comparatively, it's possible to have the designation as an important cultural landmark from the government. And so, and if you can get a landmark designation, then you can prevent it from being torn down and rebuilt. And there's really no issue with the earthquake reinforcements of Jingu Stadium, that they are in place. So whoever wants to rebuild it must have some other thing in mind.
Money.
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
A lot of money is what they have in mind.
Right. It really looks like when they made the plan for this redevelopment, it's as if the planners just had a map of what was there and they just erased everything. I'm like, okay, what can we do with this space? They weren't thinking about how to preserve anything was there or work around anything. It's just, let's just make it a blank slate. Another comment here. I've been a big fan of the Swallows for more than a half century, and the Jingu Stadium has been one of my favorite places to visit. However, I always think that Japanese baseball fans are less emotionally attached to the home stadium of their favorite team. Especially in the case of the Swallows, the stadium is owned by the Meiji Jingu, and the team has nothing to do with the operation of the stadium. I'm sorry that if the team itself were actually involved in the stadium's operations, the team's fans might have been more supportive of preservation of the stadium. Oh, that's an interesting comment.
Yeah.
Because, this team hasn't said anything, and there hasn't been a lot of word from the fans so far.
Well, that's one big difference between Japan, professional baseball, and the States, or, the teams own their own stadiums, or they get the taxpayers to finance the construction. But in Japan, the teams are, they rent the stadiums usually.
Mhm.
They pay a lot of money in rent, and it's one of the reasons that professional baseball is not really financially successful in Japan because of that.
Interesting.
Like American Major League Baseball has a gross revenue of $10 billion, but in Japan it's I think it's somewhere between $1 billion and $1.5 billion for all of it.
Wow.
But yeah, I agree. That's an interesting point.
So in Japan, Koshien and Jingu Stadium are the only two stadiums that have the historical design that are remaining. For that reason, particularly, we really want to keep continue the current stadium and not have it changed. But by renovating, you can get all the functionality you need for a modern stadium that can be added, and you can make it, even more appealing. And so, there must be a way to be able to do that. And I wonder why we haven't heard, that kind of plan. Why hasn't someone put a plan forward to renovate the stadium and to update it? And why isn't that being talked about?
Yes, good point.
That's a good point.
Koshien Stadium was renovated, and the Tigers and high school baseball continue to play there every year. They managed to do that. The same thing in Miyagi with Sendai Stadium.
Right. And one of the features of this whole development project for Jingu Gayan is that all the planning was done out of the public eye, in as much secret as possible. And whenever there was some sort of legal obligation to interact with the public, it was done as quietly as possible. And so it really seemed like they were trying to hide what they were doing. And then it was just sort of thrust on the public as, okay, here's what we're doing, with no discussion of alternative plans, like as was just said, okay, how about renovation for the stadium? Or as Bob, as you mentioned, ICOMOS, the UNESCO organization, put out an alternative plan that would not require cutting down any trees. So, there's been no discussion about alternatives. It's just like, oh, here's the plan and we're doing it, and it has to happen this way. Very unilateral type action from Tokyo's government.
Well, this is a private enterprise, as I understand. I mean, it's the whole complex is owned by Meiji Religious Corporation, Meiji Jingu Religious Corporation. So it's private, and they're protected by tax laws. Religious corporations don't have to pay any tax. They can do it essentially what they want. I mean, you can't just build anything, even if you're on your own property, without government permission.
Right.
I mean, this is not really a government project.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's complicated because it's owned by Jingu Gayan, the property, but it's only owned by Jingu Gayan because the government gave it to Jingu Gayan at one point, because it was actually national land originally. So there's that aspect, but also the Tokyo government is involved in this plan, and they're like, oh, I think the Tokyo government would like to say that they don't have anything to do with it, but actually they do. So that's kind of a tricky point of it also. Another question here, a baseball related question. I've been to many places in Japan, including rural areas. One thing that always exists in those rural areas, if they have schools, which shows that they still have school-age persons, is a baseball practice area in that village or town. If their local government has more money, then they even have several stadiums. From your knowledge about baseball in Japan, has this just happened by coincidence, or is it some mandatory thing that every place has to have a baseball stadium?
Well, when baseball was first introduced, 1872, and then it was played, on school and college levels throughout the 80s, the Monbusho Ministry of Education approved baseball as a tool of education because it taught group cooperation and development of spirit and heart. They liked the fact that it was Japan didn't have a group game, and they thought that this would help teach group cooperation as well as fighting spirit and the other usual stuff. But so from the beginning, the Monbusho encouraged it, and baseball was part of the curriculum, school curriculum in some schools. Baseball really didn't take off as a national sport until 1896 when Ichigo played the Yokohama team. But before that, it had already established a base with approval by the government. The government liked the fact that schools, they wanted schools to adopt baseball as part of their education. And students had to go, they didn't get school credit for going to baseball practice after school, but all the schools had martial arts programs. You study judo or kendo or aikido, and baseball just became one of those sports. So that's why I think you see baseball, all schools have baseball stadiums. It just became part of the culture, the tradition.
Mm-hmm. Well, then you think of Shohei Ohtani, and he's from a very rural area, right? And so, but he grew up playing baseball in that rural area.
Right.
Yeah. Next question. So I was aware that that student baseball in the pre-war period was very, very popular among the public. But from listening today, I realized that that was over a very long period, and really the impact was rather large. And so thanks for sharing that with us.
Right. In fact, the biggest difference between baseball in Japan and baseball in the United States is that baseball started as a professional sport in America. It goes all the way back to the middle of the 19th century. But Japan started as an amateur sport, and it developed this amateur tradition, which is so strong that by 1935, when the Tokyo Giants, the first professional league, was established in 1936, people were wondering whether it would succeed because the idea of playing, for money was somehow impure. But yeah, a long history. That's a huge difference.
Comment more than question. To my surprise, ginkgo trees are one of the longest lived species on the planet. Perhaps that has a play. That's a good point. The ones that are there now, they're going to cut down 19 of the ginkgo trees. They're 100 years old, and they're these huge, gorgeous trees. And then, as Bob mentioned, the main row is endangered by where they're planning to put the new stadium. So yeah, that's a good point. Does the Meiji Shrine have a public statement on the redevelopment? At one point, the grounds were considered sacred to the main shrine, and the development plan for the 1940 Tokyo Olympics encountered opposition from that aspect. I didn't realize that about the 1940 Olympics. I'll just answer this one. To my knowledge, they have not made any public statement whatsoever, and they just nothing. They're not saying anything. Which again raises lots of questions. I don't feel there's a strong sense of objection from Yakult Swallows fans, who may be the best group to make this issue more visible through national broadcasting. Am I wrong for this impression?
I don't know. I think you have to organize them, Rochelle.
Yeah, you're right. I'd like to hear more from Yakult Swallows fans. I've heard, sort of individually from people. I would love to try make connections with the Oendan and other fans groups. I'm not quite sure how to do that. So if anyone has any suggestions or introductions, I would appreciate it. Because I think a lot of fans maybe don't even realize what's happening. And I think that's part of the problem too. And then lastly, I appreciate the wonderful talk given us by Mr. Robert Whiting. Thank you very much again. And I'm going to say thank you also. That is our last question. And oh, I'm sorry. No, it's not. There's 2 more. There's 3 more. Well, we've got even more here. Sorry. I was going to wrap up, but we've got more questions if you have a few more minutes, Bob. Governor Koike is declaring that Tokyo has to do more effort for the SDGs and global warming responses, including mandatory installation of solar panels on new houses. I do agree those words. So it's frustrating that Koike is supporting the cutting of green areas in central Tokyo. It evidently shows that beholden by Mitsui money, she is not really caring about SDGs and global warming seriously due to all that money she's getting.
I agree. Good point.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that I've been thinking, this whole thing kind of makes no sense that she's supporting it, because she talks about the environment. She's a former environmental minister. The whole thing doesn't make sense. And so the only explanation is that she's getting a lot of money somehow. Because there's really nothing else that's as logical as an explanation. Even a private project, the proponent of the project should respect the public value of this historical area. Because the Jingu area has been conceived as a public park for almost 100 years, Tokyo Metropolitan Government must be accountable for the project. Public participation process of the case has been very poor compared to the Japanese standard. Yeah.
Yes, good point.
Yeah, very good point. And then finally, can you tell how what's Koike's view about this? Is she really strong supporter, or does she just go with the flow as she always does? I can just tell you what I've observed. I think that originally she didn't think people were going to be upset about this. And I think she thought, oh, well, we're making a development. It'll be cool. Everyone will be happy. She just thought everyone was going to be okay or was going to like it. Then this spring, when it turns out that it was such fierce opposition, she kind of made a lot of excuses for it. She told the developers, oh, get the public involved. Well, it's kind of late to get the public involved. You've already made the plan. She's like, oh, let's preserve the trees. And she kept saying that. Well, unless you change what buildings you're putting where, if you're putting a building where a tree is, then the tree's going to go away. I mean, that's not going to change. So she's kind of made just a lot of empty excuses. And you're right, it's kind of going with the flow. Really, I'd like to see her take a courageous step and say, hey, look, it really is turning out that people are not happy about this and we're going to change course. If she could do that, make some sort of heroic gesture, that would be the best. I don't know if she's going to do that or not, but it's really a mystery to me why she wants to be known as the governor of Tokyo who ruined Jingu and who ruined Jingu Stadium and the rugby stadium. Does she want that to be her legacy? Again, it makes no sense to me.
Yes. Let's keep fighting.
Yeah, okay, let's keep fighting. So on that word, if anyone has not yet signed the petition calling for revision of the redevelopment plan, I've got a QR code on here. And so if you could click on that and sign the petition, that would be much appreciated. And again, if you can connect us with any of the baseball related groups, that would be great. And contact your elected officials, contact anyone in the press, write about it on social media, whatever you can do to raise your voice. Everyone's voice makes a difference. So anything you can do would be great. So want to thank Bob for this really, really interesting presentation and for your support. Thank you everyone who joined us, and we'll stay in touch. And again, if you sign up for the petition, there will be updates as well from there. So thanks so much.
Yeah, one more thing. The article that I wrote is online on Zach Yukon Fuji, and the English version of it is on my Substack site, Robert Whiting's Japan. you could copy that and circulate it around the globe, and let's get everybody involved.
Oh yes, that's a good point. That's a good point. That's an excellent resource that definitely suggest everyone look at and share either the Japanese or the English versions. There was one comment here too. How can we contact people? Both Bob and I are on Twitter, and so Twitter DMs are a good way to get in touch. I'm on Twitter in both English and Japanese. And Bob, I think you have just one Twitter account, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So it should be pretty easy to find both of us on there.
Okay.
Okay.
Sure.
Great. Okay. Well, wonderful. Thank you again, everyone. Appreciate your joining us on this rainy morning. And let's keep talking about this and make some noise. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.